Yeah. And so, what I was pointing out is that Jesus says there in the part about adultery, he says, you have heard it said, and he's quoting from the Ten Commandments, you shall not commit adultery. He says, but I say to you, if you have lusted after a woman in your own heart, then you have already committed adultery. Now, you could look at that and say, well, then it sounds like lusting after someone is a sin and adultery is a sin. So, I mean, if you've already done the sin, why not, do it physically?
Yeah.
You've already messed up. Why not just, doesn't that just mean that, well, you've already done this, you might as well do that?
Hey, welcome to Whitefield Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us this week. I'm here with Pastor Nick Cady, pastor of the church here, Whitefield Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado, in case you're watching from out of state. And we are in our series, Behold Your King, in a study of the Gospel of Matthew. And the sermon on Sunday was how to be right with God. We were in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 32. Jumping into those passages, thou shalt not murder and commit adultery. Always fun to jump into those. But you missed it, whitefieldchurch.com. You can find it there, download it there. And also, if you want to get updated and, anytime we go live or anything like that, you want to download our app, WFCC, I think, is you'll find it on the Apple Store or Google Play. And, this is a great way of just staying in touch with what's going on here and being able to get our sermons, when we go live and when they are uploaded. And also any of your favorite streaming platforms, whether that's Facebook and YouTube or on any of your podcast apps as well. We are everywhere. And if you would, interact with that content, that certainly helps a lot in boosting what we're doing here. And, our desire is just to provide Christ-centered, gospel-centered answers to people's questions when they're thinking about how to be right with God, and it'll pop up there. And the way you can do that is just by interacting, asking questions, thumbs up, subscribing, sharing. Any of those kind of things really helps to boost it in the almighty algorithm that is in the internet. So pray that you would do that and certainly help us out a lot. But here today, we want to talk about sin and divorce, two of our most, things we love talking about here at church. People talk about it all the time. We want to talk about sin, and it's kind of the main theme of what you were talking about on Sunday is definitely sin, but the topic of divorce came up, and as in verses, I think verse 31, 32, that we kind of wanted to touch on that just a little bit as well. But let's just talk about sin. I think one of the points you made, and I think it's well worth kind of, just kind of focusing on that a little bit, is the quantitative versus qualitative aspects of sin. That yes, sin is sin, but the consequences of sin is not the same throughout. So we just want to talk a little bit about that, and I thought it's well worth just kind of bringing some explanation to that again.
Yeah. And so, what I was pointing out is that Jesus says there in the part about adultery, he says, you have heard it said, and he's quoting from the Ten Commandments, you shall not commit adultery. He says, but I say to you, if you have lusted after a woman in your own heart, then you have already committed adultery. Now, you could look at that and say, well, then it sounds like lusting after someone is a sin and adultery is a sin. So, I mean, if you've already done the sin, why not, do it physically?
Yeah.
You've already messed up. Why not just, doesn't that just mean that, well, you've already done this, you might as well do that? And the answer is absolutely you should not do that. And Jesus' point here is talking about righteousness. You could say it's surpassing righteousness. That is the theme of the Sermon on the Mount as a whole, but it's also the theme of this section in particular. Remember, it starts in verse 20 and it ends in verse 48. And in verse 20, he says, truly I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And then he ends the section with the other bookend, or capstone, if you will, which says, therefore you must be perfect. So how righteous do you have to be? You have to be more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees. How's that possible? The only way that's possible is if you're perfect. So everything that he's doing here, he's showing us that all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Why? Because he told us in the very first verse of the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit. In case you didn't think that you were poor in spirit, in case you're still under the illusion that you're a pretty good person, here's evidence to show you that not only have you not lived up to God's standards, and no one has, but the standard of God is actually higher than you probably ever thought it was. That's really the point. Yeah. So his point is to show us that we have all sinned. His point isn't to say that committing adultery with your body with another person is equally egregious to lusting after someone in your heart, right? So in one sense, right, we say quantitative, meaning, committing adultery counts as, let's call it one sin, right? Telling a lie is one sin. They're the same quantity of sin, but they're qualitatively different, right? Like, so if I sin inside of my mind and my heart, that has different qualitative effects or different consequences for myself and for other people and for their lives. Think about like it's that ripple effect, like when you throw a rock into a pond. It doesn't just drop in and has a thing. It ripples out and it keeps going. And in many ways, sin is that way, right? You do something and then it will have these effects that oftentimes maybe you didn't foresee or you didn't think about when you were doing that initial action. You just thought, this is going to feel really good, or, this will be really satisfying. And you do that thing and you don't think, oh man, think about all of these things. I had a friend I was talking to recently and he was telling me that he had spoken with a biblical counselor about something that he was thinking about doing. Like he was tempted to do something that is a sin. And this person had said, think about the next day. Think about the day after that. Think about all of the events that are going to take place the next year. Think about all of the things that are going to take place that are going to affect other people if you do this action, right? And that's kind of the point, right? Sin has consequences, destructive consequences. And different sins have different varying levels of consequence, right? If you run a stop sign when nobody's around to see it, nobody gets hurt, it's still a sin before God, right? And it's a Bible says in James, if you've broken one law, you've broken all of the law. If you break the law at one point, you've broken the whole thing. And also, how many sins does it take to make you a sinner? Well, it takes one, and the wages of sin is death, no matter what that sin is. But, driving drunk has potentially much higher consequences than that. Or you think about all kinds of examples, and we don't need to get into details, but my point is, this is something that's clearly taught, and you can see it illustrated, for example, in the book of Leviticus, where you see that there are different penalties and different things that need to be done to atone for different kinds of sin. That denotes the fact that there's different qualities, qualitative difference amongst sins. You can see in 1 John, he talks about not all sins lead to death, but there is sin leading to death. And so he's making a differentiation between different kinds of sin and their consequences. So that's what I meant.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to think about that. And I would say that even thinking through that, some might be tempted to say, as you said, that, well, if I am committing adultery in my heart by watching pornography online versus going and doing it in person, that somehow, the effects of my sin, might be a way to kind of, wash it away. Like the consequences of my sin are not that great, but it does. Anytime we're, committing sin, we're separating ourselves from God. Mm-hmm. And I think anytime we do that, it's going to have consequences in our lives. And, we don't want to rationalize anything. And your story reminded me of a young man who came to me once, many, many years ago. And we were doing something together. I can't remember. And he just asked me, he says, I'm thinking about, getting into the porn industry. Like he said, I just want to go and see what it's like to live out in the world. And his question was, do you think God will take me back? And, I was kind of taken back by his question. But I'm sure there's a lot of people that kind of want to dabble in that thing. And I'm like, well, I don't know. I said, God will always take you back, but do you think you will want to come back? Like sin has that way of, if you are watching porn over and over and over again, or you're dabbling in some kind of sin that might not have consequences on a greater level, like you're not doing it against somebody else, it's killing your own soul.
Yes.
And I think that's important to remember, that at some point you're just going to be so hard in your heart that you're going to, that separation from God. And isn't that what that is the sin of, against the Holy Spirit, right? And that's the sin where you're just dead to God, not because he has let go of you, but because you have, just walked away from him in a sense. And so, so it's, even though it's important to make that distinction, we should be very aware that, even though you're in the comfort of your own home, you feel like you're not hurting anybody, you're hurting yourself. And that's sad. And we want to stay away from that. And let's just touch a little bit on the idea of divorce. It kind of shows up in here. And you pointed out in our discussion about that, that's not Jesus not really talking about divorce per se. He's using it as a subject to do with sin, but people are going to use it as a jumping board to, hey, what about divorce? And so let's just discuss just briefly what was Jesus talking about then in verses 31, 32 there in Matthew 5 about divorce.
Yeah, and so we didn't get to this in this week's sermon. Originally, we had planned to, and that's why there's some questions about it, like in this week's study guide. But just for the sake of time and cohesion with the sermon, I ended up making a last-minute decision to handle those verses in our next message, which is coming up this following Sunday. But it's interesting, right? Because divorce essentially forms a bridge in the discussion. He's showing a progression, right? And so you've got anger, then you've got lust, and then he talks about divorce. Now, divorce falls into the category of adultery, and he uses that word twice in those two verses. But then it also falls into the category of keeping your oaths, right? Which is the next section that he's going to talk about after that. So it falls into both. It's really important to get some historical context. And I think that helps us understand, why does Jesus bring this up? Is he just like picking random topics? Or why does he choose to talk about divorce when he could talk about something else? I think that the main reason is this, that I think people often assume that divorce right now in our culture it must be the highest it's ever been. And that's simply not the case. In Jesus' time, amongst the Jewish people, divorce was rampant, but it was also unfair. It was a man had the right to divorce his wife, but a wife didn't have the right to divorce her husband. And so Jesus is addressing that culture of divorce. There was actually two schools of thought, and I'll talk about this in the sermon that's coming up. But there were two rabbis which represented two different views. There was Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel, and one of them held a really permissive view, essentially told people what they wanted to hear, which was, you can literally get divorced for any reason as long as you give a document. And that goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, where Moses had told the people as part of the law of Moses that they had to, if a man was going to divorce his wife, he had to give her a document. Now, why would he say that? Well, Jesus points out, Jesus is going to talk, by the way, more about divorce in Matthew chapter 19. So please understand, what he's saying here in chapter 5 isn't really intended to give us an all-encompassing, theology of divorce. His purpose here is to show people that they are sinners and they're more sinful than they've ever dared to imagine. Okay, so going back to Moses, why did he say they have to give a document of divorce? Because we know that the practice at that time, imagine this, it was even more rampant for people to get divorced back in the time of Moses than it was in the time of Jesus, which is even more than it is in our day today. And the reason was because it was super easy to get divorced. Now, in Moses' time, here was the practice that was essentially trying to be curtailed. That a man, if let's say he saw another woman that he liked, he would divorce his wife, sleep with the other woman so that he could say he's not committing adultery, and he would marry her real quick, Because in those days, it wasn't like you had a marriage ceremony. It was almost like, it was just like an agreement amongst like leaders in the community and stuff. So divorce his wife, marry that woman, do his thing with her for a while, then divorce her and come back to the wife who, for example, had the kids. And that was not being allowed, right? And so the point is that Moses said, you got to give her an official document that says you're divorced, and you can't ever remarry her. That's part of Deuteronomy 24. You can't divorce your wife, marry somebody else, and then remarry her. Nowadays, we think about that and we're like, wait a second, why? Wouldn't it be good to restore that original marriage? And I've even known people who did that. And I think, in general, that is a good thing, because it wasn't what was happening in the time of Moses, which was basically just kind of like a technicality, a loophole, a workaround, so that you could do whatever you want, sleep with multiple people, and not technically break the law, right? So Moses said, no, you can't do that. Put some rules around it. That was part of the inspired law of God. Then we come to the time of Jesus, and people had, again, from this one school of thought, taken that and said, oh, well, Moses said you can just give them a document. So men were just divorcing women all the time, like for any reason. That's literally the phrase that's used in Matthew 19. Is it permissible to divorce your wife for any reason? And Jesus is saying, no, this is so far away from the heart and intent of God. Again, the purpose of this, what is the heart of the law? What's the purpose? What's God's original design? And Jesus is saying anything that deviates from God's original intent and design is sin. And I think there are many people today, they read that and they're like, wait a second, Jesus can't be saying that I'm a sinner because I've been divorced or because I married someone who was divorced. Is he saying that that's adultery and that I'm a sinner? Well, first of all, don't be so afraid of being called a sinner, because the Bible literally says that everybody's a sinner. And it's actually Jesus' point here in this section. You're a sinner. Like I said, he's the anti-Oprah, right? Instead of saying, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car, he says, you're a sinner, and you're going to hell. Yeah. And that is literally the point of this, but it's not to break you. It's not to shame you. It is because blessed are those who are poor in spirit. He wants to bring you to a realization of your spiritual poverty that already exists. He's not making you spiritually poor. He's not labeling you. He's helping you to see what is already true, right? And so in that culture, understand this is the point. Many people had been divorced, and they thought it was fine because they just handed out these certificates of divorce. Therefore, technically, they're keeping the law of Moses. And Jesus says, you know what? That still deviates from God's design. And you're an adulterer and she's an adulterer, and you guys are all a bunch of adulterers. And so just because you previously thought, I'm a good person, I've never committed adultery, well, actually you have.
Yeah, no, that's not, too fine a point you put on there is the idea of the rationalization of our sin, And, even though they were technically, within the law, it was still sin. And that's the point that Jesus is trying to make. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees and Sadducees, who technically keep the law. That basically, there's a lot of rationalization. And of course, that happens in our lives all the time. We're technically doing stuff. We're finding the edge of where we're allowed to go and things like that. And so that's a very important point when it comes to sin and our rationalization of it. And that's a good way to end there. That's something we need to be very aware of. But it's a tough passage to work through, and we can continue. And then you just got a preview of next week's message. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, adultery and all those things. And of course, we're going to touch on it more in Matthew 19, you said as well, about the topic of divorce. If you have any questions about that, that's a very difficult subject to talk through. It's a very painful subject. It is a sin that does affect everybody. If anyone's been through a divorce, that it impacts much more than the people that are involved, the couple. It ripples. That ripple effect can go far and wide and last a long time. And so,
can I jump in one more thing?
Oh, yeah.
This is the last thing I'll say, just because I'm thinking through, people who might listen to this. When it says that adultery has taken place, I don't think it means that someone is living in ongoing adultery. And I think that that's an important distinction. If let's say you have been divorced, are you living in ongoing adultery? I think the answer to that is no. I think that if you have married someone who's been divorced, are you all living in an ongoing adulterous relationship? I think the answer is no.
No.
So,
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. And so, yeah, do you agree with that? That's a good question. That a lot of people would say, yes or no to that question. And I think I agree with you 100%. But yeah, it's something we're going to dive into a lot more as we get in more and more into this subject, and of course, a lot more in the book of Matthew, other than sin and divorce, and because of course, Jesus is setting us up for the final, which is him dying, him the perfect sacrifice on our behalf. And so you missed it, whitefieldschurch.com, and we look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.